going to address the topic of Lacanian psychoanalysis in its relationship to phenomenology, more specifically Jacques Lacan's relationship to phenomenology. Our first comment could be simply to say that this is a very short topic. Mad Magazine used to have a feature called Very Short Books. For example, Donald Trump's Guide to Wit and Wisdom. And it sounds, to begin with, that Lacan and Phenomenology is going to be a very short book. But as it turns out, the story is a little bit more complicated. So it gives us an interesting way of introducing the topic to listen to Alain Badiou and describing his sense of Lacan's relationship to phenomenology, structuralism, and psychoanalysis. Now, Alain Badiou, obviously perhaps the most famous currently living French philosopher, has a long extended engagement with Sartre and Sartrean existentialism. So you could, and of course is a interpreter and someone who utilizes Lacanian theory in a highly kind of creative way. So we could say that he's a good means of introducing some of these concepts. So I'm going to read a little bit of Alain Badiou from Jacques Lacan, Past and Present, a Dialogue, and we'll see what he says about this relationship. So he starts off by saying, I myself had been very influenced by Sartre. Sartre as a concept of the subject was highly important to me in my political theorization and my philosophy, and it was necessary for me to break from phenomenology. And I think that statement's interesting because it suggests that a whole range of intellectuals, particularly in France and continental Europe at the time, phenomenology and existentialism was very much the air they breathed, the water they swam in. So why does he want to break with phenomenology? This is what he says, and he gives us a little bit of an introduction to what we might understand by phenomenology. He says, from its invention by Husserl, phenomenology folded the thought of the subject back into a philosophy of consciousness. It is rooted in lived experience, immediate and primitive. The subject is confounded with consciousness and the transparent comprehension of what happens to them. It's not by chance that phenomenology, think of Merleau-Ponty, accords so much importance to perception. It is the most elementary experience of this direct and intentional relationship consciousness has with the world. End of quote. So let's just pick up a couple of qualifiers there. Number one, we're talking about a philosophy of consciousness. We're talking about an approach, a philosophy where the subject is, in his terms, confounded with consciousness. There's also a sense of the transparent comprehension of what happens to the person. Now, you may start to be anticipating where there will be some differences and some similarities in Lacanian psychoanalysis. Clearly, the notion of a subject will be important, but an appeal to consciousness is not really going to be a big priority for a Lacanian approach. We'll also note in that quote that there's a reference to Merleau-Ponty, the reference to perception, elementary experience, and a direct relationship consciousness has with the world. Again there, this idea that there might be a direct, unmediated relationship to the world is going to be a place where there's some divergence. It's very difficult to think about a moment in Lacan where there's ever a sense that the subject has an unmediated relationship to the world, precisely because the symbolic language structures get in between that relationship. Anyways, let's continue with Alain Badiou. The subject is apprehended as an interiority, seen from a point of view of its feelings, its emotions, and so on. The result is a heavy focus on the reflexive ego or self and the sphere of intimacy or inwardness. He goes on to say, in order to free up a thought of revolutionary emancipation, I had to extract myself from this phenomenological model of the subject that's at once reflexive and existential. So again, we can highlight a couple of points here. Number one, this sense of interiority, that may sound of interest psychoanalytically. But once again, this idea that there may be some transparency whereby feelings, emotions, and so on could, as it were, directly be portrayed or described is something that doesn't sit well with the general psychoanalytic ethos, which is always going to emphasize the splitness, the dividedness, the lack of transparency that the subject exemplifies unto themselves, right? This is the divided subject that is characterized by the unconscious, and hence a lot of these claims start to sound a little bit tricky. Also worth emphasizing this idea of the reflexive subject. Many forms of psychology want to highlight this is a kind of self-reflexive mode of practice, and it's often given to us as a criteria of good practice, even often as a criteria of ethical practice. But the notion of the reflexive subject simply doesn't work in Lacanian psychoanalysis. Or differently put, if there is a reflexive subject, that is not the subject. Because what the subject is, in a Lacanian standpoint, is precisely the effect of division, of non-commensurateness. So by the time we're referring to a reflexive, self-inciting, reflective subject, that's a kind of an imaginary effect which is bypassing the real effect of division, of non-transparency that characterizes the subject of the unconscious. Right, so we've seen a couple of things that Badiou has to say. Let's add a little bit more, and here we're going more directly to Lacan, and we're staying with his words, which is helpful. He then says, well, where does Lacan fit into this context? On the one hand, he takes part in a break with phenomenology, all the more so to the extent that he knew very well the thought of Jean-Paul Sartre and Merleau-Ponty. He inserts himself into the structuralist galaxy, not only because he had recourse to logical mathematical formalisms, but also because he renounced the reflexive subject as the center of all experience. From his analytic perspective, the subject hinges on an irreflexive and in certain ways trans-individual structure, the unconscious, which for Lacan depends entirely on language. So we've anticipated a few of those points. What's nice to emphasize, and we will explore this in more detail, Lacan is very well versed in his friend Maurice Merleau-Ponty's phenomenology. He's also very well versed in the work of Sartre. So it is not simply a kind of naive or ignorant rejection. It's a rejection of, or a considered separation from phenomenology, which is an informed one. Also significant here is, again, he's referring to the reflexive subject is not something, the reflexive subject as the center of experience is not something that Lacan can accept. But he emphasizes that structuralism opened up things for Lacan, not only in as much as it enables a kind of formalization, a kind of systematic way of examining unconscious phenomena and subjective phenomena, but also because the unconscious entails a trans-individual element, language. And I mean, just to make that point, maybe it seems obvious, language is something which is never kind of reducible to the phenomenological world of a singular individual, because it's by definition a shared social symbolic medium. And that thus will necessarily complicate the idea, certainly for Lacan, that any subject can have an unmediated direct relationship to the world. But now comes an interesting point. Badiou wants to insist that Lacan, even in his recourse to structuralism, does not go so far as the hard structuralists, like Foucault or the Heideggerians or Derrida, who consider the category of the subject to be the mere avatar of defunct metaphysics. Rather, Lacan wants to conserve this category, the category of the subject, in order to renew it from the ground up. This is because the subject remains at the heart of clinical experience. So Lacan saves the subject in the midst of a full-on structuralist offensive against it. His subject is certainly subjugated in some way to the signifying chain, to language. It is divided, it is unknown to itself, split, exposed to a radical alterity. But for him, it remains coherent, even necessary, to propose a theory of the subject. Now, one question we could pose here, the notion of the subject seems pretty crucial to phenomenology. And in that respect, you would have to say, well, maybe to existentialism itself, that maybe the kind of minimal umbilical cord that still connects some facet of Lacan's prehistory as a theorist to phenomenology remains intact. It's a very nice description that emphasizes that a structuralist, as Lacan may have been in various moments, he doesn't neglect, and indeed cannot neglect, this category of the subject. So right towards the end of his thoughts, and we'll draw to a conclusion with Alain Badiou now, he gives a kind of recapitulation. He says, reiterating what we've just said, the notion of the subject, a concept that was central in phenomenology, and for Sartre in particular, who tied the subject to a theory of consciousness and freedom, was one that Lacan retained. Lacan walked along a ridge, along a completely particular brink. On the one hand, he takes up and refounds the structuralist heritage by showing that the unconscious is itself structured like a language. But on the other hand, he redeploys the concept of the subject in all its radicality, affirming the possibility for each and everyone to freely undertake a risk of an ethical nature. So the notion of the subject is retained, but it is not retained in a way that highlights anything like the immediacy of experience, of an appeal to experience, or the reflexive subject. So that gives us a kind of little mini roadmap of where we're going to go. But while we're doing that, let's make one further point, and then we can start to complicate the picture a little bit. We find in Lacan's Seminar 3, the psychoses, a couple of remarks which seem very instructive and will help put a little benchmark in place. He says, I think it's the very first session of that seminar, very clear terms, make no mistake, I am not going to fall into the myth of immediate experience that forms the basis of what people call existential psychology. So he's calling it existential psychology, but this idea of the myth of immediate experience clearly has a resonance as a kind of critique also against phenomenology. Immediate experience is no better place to arrest or captivate us than any other science. He goes on, Freud's teaching brings resources into play that are beyond immediate experience and cannot be grasped in any tangible fashion. So that phrase, it brings into play, into consideration, things that are beyond immediate experience, seems very important. He continues, in psychoanalysis, as in physics, it's not the property of color as sensed and differentiated by direct experience that holds our attention. It's something which is behind us and which conditions it. So I suppose we would want to think about what is it that is behind it, that conditions it. He says one further thing that we should note, Freudian experience is in no way preconceptual. It's not a pure experience, but one that is well and truly structured. Now, of course, it doesn't take a genius to figure out that part of what is structuring it is language itself. Language is the necessary interposing mediator between subject and experience, between subject and world, between subject and their interlocutor. So that's something that we should bear in mind. But he'll also go on to develop in interesting terms the dialectic that occurs between the speech uttered by a speaker and how it is taken up and how it is imagined that the interlocutor will consider that. Which is interesting because on the one hand, we're moving away from phenomenology in as much as there's this emphasis on language as itself, a very significant factor that mediates and necessarily mediates experience, but it's also wanting to maintain something like a notion of intersubjectivity. A number of commentators have noted this. In early Lacan, we have an idea of the intersubjective nature of the psychoanalytic engagement. In later Lacan, that reference to intersubjectivity falls away, and we hear a lot more about signifying change and so on and so forth. But it's useful just to bear in mind that some of the vocabulary of phenomenology seems to still have some momentum in early Lacan. Not just the notion of the subject, of course, but the idea of intersubjectivity. So let us note one kind of seemingly contrary moment to what we've just been saying. And in doing so, we're going to refer back to Benvenuto and Kennedy's The Works of Jacques Lacan. It's a pretty old text, introductory text, but I love it. It's often got little germs of wisdom. So they have a brief commentary on the 1936 paper that Lacan produces beyond the reality principle. And they make a couple of notes which I think will be useful to us in highlighting something of Lacan's indebtedness or partial indebtedness to something within the realm of phenomenology. So they're talking about how Lacan is, and remember 36 is pretty early, how Lacan is thinking about how one should best go about the study of human phenomena or subjectivity. And they make the following remark on Beyond the Reality principle. In his attempt to define a new way of studying human phenomena, Lacan was deeply influenced by the methods of phenomenology. The latter literally means the study or description of appearances. A phenomenology may refer to any sustained and penetrating description of how things appear. Again, one can already start to sense a kind of separation. How things appear is not a reasonable explanation for Lacan, but an attention to the details of an account offered by a subject. That is something that Lacan is interested, particularly if it entails a shift, which is very Freudian in nature, to listening to the meanings, the utterances, the words, the speech of a given patient as themselves of primary significance, rather than utilizing that as a kind of more positivist psychiatry might be as indicators of certain things lying behind speech. And that idea, of course, is very Lacanian and will stay with Lacan throughout. So let's see what else Benvenuto and Kennedy have to say. Lacan considered that the application of phenomenology to human phenomena could be seen as a challenge to the apparently good sense of a more positivist scientific method. So again, here we start to find how there might be an interesting overlap with the Freudian idea that we need to take the words, the accounts, the meaning, the textured descriptions that the speaking subject, the patient, offers us as a primary value, and a more phenomenological emphasis on descriptions, on exactly the experience of the subject as it's uttered. Now, of course, there's going to be important differentiations, but let's continue with what they say. Freud gives us the right to consider psychical phenomena their own object and to focus the psychical phenomena in their own right. They then skip ahead to say a few things about phenomenology. The phenomenological method concentrates on the subject's own account of themselves. They are seen as an object, not as an object of an investigation, but instead as a source of information. New ways of understanding can be found by listening to the subject without preconceptions. To omit what appears unsystematized or senseless in the psychic material would be to lose sight of what is important. This approach, said Lacan, is very similar to that of psychoanalysis and the practice of free association. So we'll say a little bit more of that as we continue, but you could say that there's an interesting topic deserving of a lot more scrutiny and exploration here. You could say that the prime methodology or the prime method or prime approach of psychoanalysis involves free association. That's the fundamental rule. And in free association, the subject is invited to speak, to say whatever comes to mind without systematization and without any omission of material. Does that ring any bells, sound familiar to any method or priority in phenomenology? Presumably it sounds a little bit, not the same, but it sounds a little bit like it has some overlaps with the notion of bracketing or the epoché, whereby when one does phenomenology, one attempts a description without passing any judgment, without thinking about things in terms of causative logic, scientific logic, but in terms of how they are experienced. Interestingly, at least two things should take our attention here. In this bracketing epoché of developing phenomenological descriptions, one sets aside the so-called natural attitude, one sets aside the presumptions, the prejudices, the prior seeming understandings that one has of things, and leaves those to one side. You could say that that is also, in some respects, part of what one does in free association. One doesn't worry about judging or censoring, one speaks. One speaks as much as one can. In both of them, we have a kind of lack of systematization. Phenomenological method says describe experience, not with hierarchies or not with a kind of ranking. Describe as much as you can in the wealth of detail. We have a similar attempt to avoid a hierarchization, a kind of potentially all-inclusiveness within free association. We also have, as I've just mentioned, the need to put aside judgments and just speak. Interestingly, there's a further parallel to be made, and that, of course, involves the idea that when we're talking about the epoché, bracketing in phenomenology, we set aside the question of does something actually exist to talk about and describe the experience itself. You could say there's an interesting resonance with that happens in psychoanalysis within free association, because the idea then is not so much to partition or filter or limit what is spoken by reference to the actuality of the thing. In fact, quite the opposite. One often tries to elicit the phantasmatic thoughts and ideas that may seem not to be grounded in a kind of reality or truth. So there's some interesting kinds of parallels there. Let's not conflate the two though, and one comment that comes to mind is that you could say one rudimentary difference here is that phenomenological accounts are pretty heavy on content, right? Description. They want to gather a lot of content and a lot of detail. But on the other hand, while a similar thing may be said to apply with free association, the way one listens to and engages free association, remember the even hovering attention of the analyst, is one that is also attentive to the form, not only the content, the form of how things are said. Now maybe there's some modes of phenomenology that also focus on that, but just let's keep that in mind for a Lacanian distinction. An attention to form of what is spoken is very, very important, where presumably there's maybe more of a prioritization on the content, the meaningfulness of what is said in phenomenology. And of course, we can reiterate also that the meaningfulness of what is said is not often what the analyst is listening for. They're rather listening for the unintentional, the slippages of speech, the fractures of speech. In other words, the form of the speech. So let's wrap up and say that I'll just mention two last quotes from this, and then we'll wrap up, having tried to emphasize that there's some debts that Lacan may have to pay to phenomenology. They're talking about free association, Benvenuto and Kennedy, and they say, the way the subject gives an account of themselves, with all their hesitations, with all their omissions, their imaginary formations, such as dreams, delusions, and phobias, all these moments of incoherence are phenomena which reveal the mental life of the individual. They are what one could call the significant fragments of the subject's life. The problem of how to give meaning to phenomena, which seems to be what Lacan meant when he spoke about a relativity of meaning in Beyond the Reality principle, he saw this as a nodal problem of analytic experience. So let's just say then, I think it would be a useful and probably accurate characterization. There's a kind of moment when, although it might be seen as strategic and highly conditional, Lacan seems to potentially, I'm qualifying my claims quite a lot here, see a phenomenological moment as a kind of strategic ally. How so? Because it foregrounds the fact of the subject's own descriptions, speech, understandings, meanings. And for that reason, it's useful to have it as a means of not going to positivist psychiatric forms, which always want to look behind the speech to something else. But even when he's doing that, he's interested in something else. And so what they end up saying is, yes, there was a problem of how to give meaning to phenomena that Lacan was fundamentally interested in. In fact, he sees this question as a nodal problem in analytic experience. But they go on to note, and I think this is very important, Freud saw in language an irreducible phenomena of analytic work and the proper medium of psychoanalysis. They go on to qualify that claim and say, well, maybe not everyone would read Freud like that, but that's a nice way of suggesting how phenomenology will be simply nuanced or put to one side by Lacan, because as much as it's important to pay attention to the intersubjectivity of the clinical process, as much as it's important to pay attention to the subject and the subject's own accounts, the fact that this is happening in language means that language itself must also be engaged with, and engaged with as a fundamental facet of what's going on.